Hi everyone, I'm here today with Kris, who's a speculative fiction writer and also a YouTuber. I came across her video on how she got a literary agent. It was very inspiring. It made me yearn definitely a lot, but also gave me a lot of hope. And since then, I've been loving watching Kris's videos. They're very cozy. She does a lot of content around being a writer and like the process of writing, querying. So you should definitely check out her channel. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to chat.
So I was wondering if we could start off by talking a little bit about what projects you have in store. Because am I correct in saying that you have a couple things in the works?
Yeah, so right now I am on submission with a science fiction novel. So that's kind of on the go right now. My agent has been pitching to publishers. So typically the process, if you're pursuing traditional publishing like I am, is you would write your book and it has to be done and polished and everything. And then you start querying literary agents. And then once you sign with an agent, they may or may not edit the book more with you, which was the case for me. I rewrote the book a few times with my agent, and then um, my agent on my behalf pitches the manuscript to publishers, and then you just wait and see if any publishers are interested in the manuscript, and then that's kind of how you get a book deal as a traditionally published author. So I'm kind of in the stage where we're on submission. We're just kind of waiting to hear news, and it's a very, very, very slow process. I know from some of my other writer friends that submission can be super fast, and they can get a book deal in like 2 weeks, or it can take like over a year. So there's kind of like no
Wow.
typical timeline these days because the industry has been apparently really slow, especially since like COVID. But yeah, that's
Hmm.
what my agent is doing right now. So I have one book on sub, and then I'm currently writing a new book, which is a fantasy.
Very cool. Can we get like a pitch for each of the two?
Yeah, I guess. Well, the one that I'm still writing is like it's only a first draft, so things are always subject to change, and I haven't like
Yeah.
nailed down how I want to pitch it. But I guess for the book that is currently on submission, the one line pitch is that it's a cyberpunk retelling of The Great Gatsby, or I guess like a reimagining. So it kind of takes the story of The Great Gatsby and it remixes it and reinterrogates the themes in the context of like a late stage capitalist sci-fi dystopian. So it's a little bit weird. It's a little genre bendy. Sci-fi is like a very difficult thing to write in traditional publishing, especially as a debut writer. So it wasn't a book that I thought I would even query, but the things stars kind of aligned for it. So, um,
Hmm.
that's a book that I've been wanting to write for years now, and I'm glad that it's kind of, at least getting a chance to be pitched right now. And then for my fantasy work, it's an adult fantasy. It has gone through a lot of different iterations over the years, but it's kind of like I would say the setting is inspired by 1900s Manila and kind of the historical period around the time where there was like US occupation in Manila, and kind of like that period of uh, resistance and revolution and the political turmoil. And it's kind of set in the sort of like a jazz age in a way, in the sense that it's like 1920s and there's a lot of like cultural change happening, but maybe not
Hmm.
jazz age in the way that we would think about it in America. So I think it's like a story that I've been wanting to write for a really long time. It's very anti-colonial. It has to do a lot with memory and translation, and ancestry, I guess, but also like the experience of being diaspora and not growing up in your ancestral homeland, and the kind of like dissonance that that creates for a person.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think my comps for the book right now have been like Jade City, meets Babel meets The Witcher, because there's kind of like a lot of gang politics. That's kind of like the crux of the story. But the main character is working on these like old archaic translations. So there's a lot of like commentary on um, what it's like to be a translator and what it's like to translate specifically a dead language. And then also The Witcher, just because there's a lot of like, there's like a kind of an undercurrent of monsters and mythology. So that's kind of the mix of that book.
Yeah, they both sound very creative and unique. Well, how exactly do you define cyberpunk? I've always wondered, but I've never actually looked it up.
Yeah, it's so cyberpunk is a genre that I think is like so interesting because it has really, to me, I feel like it's still really underexplored. But I think like the way that it's usually described um, is sort of late stage capitalist tech driven dystopia. A lot of times it's depicted as a technocracy. The A lot of the time it's also described as like high tech, low life. So there's a lot of rampant technology in the world, but there's a lot of class disparity. So you'll have a very poor working class, and there's essentially no concept of a middle class anymore in this dystopia. And then there's just like a really super elite um, ruling class, I guess. So that's like the level one basics of how I imagine cyberpunk to be. And then I think step two of cyberpunk is, uh, you know, body modifications and transhumanism. Like, how human are you the more that uh, swap your limbs for, uh, metal parts, or you kind of integrate technology with the biological body. And then further than that, I think a lot of cyberpunk also makes commentary on class and technology, and usually those are very integral themes. But
Mhm.
it was a genre that was pioneered by William Gibson, and I think that's why, with the way that William Gibson writes, it's very like almost pulls from noir crime fiction. So it's kind of like typically very broody male protagonists doing crimes or solving crimes or something like that. That's kind of how classic cyberpunk has been, but I think it's very cool to see how the genre has evolved, and more diverse voices have been kind of contributing to the canon of it.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds like very high stakes, a lot of polarity. It seems like a lot of
Yeah,
tension for readers to be sucked in.
yes, very typically very action driven. Um, but I think like I've always wanted to approach cyberpunk almost in a more like quieter way. Like I think when I was writing my cyberpunk book, it was like I wanted to sort of take the wild cyberpunk setting, but also approach it in a very character driven, internally driven way, which is why, you know, a a retelling of The Great Gatsby was sort of this like weird thing that I had developed, because I was like, what would it be like to put this like very quiet character like Nick Carraway in a cyberpunk dystopia? Um, but yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, and very beloved, Great Gatsby, so it makes sense that people are going to be drawn to that.
Hopefully, we'll see if the book sells.
Well, what's that been like for you while you're waiting on publishers to make deals?
Yeah, submission is a very bizarre process. I think it's kind of like querying, except in a lot of ways it's worse. Because I think uh, querying is very hard, and I think submission is can be better in the sense that you have like the support of your agent, assuming you sign with a great agent. But it can also be very nerve wracking because you've invested so much time at that point, and your literary agent does not get paid until that book sells. So, when you have an agent, when you and your agent have put in so much time and effort to polish a manuscript, and you feel like you're just on the doorstep of that final gatekeeper, it can be very soul crushing to get rejections. It can be you can get that sort of conflicting feedback, which I know you've been querying, so you know that like sometimes you just get like feedback on a rejection and you're like, I don't know if this is actionable. I don't know if I should ignore it. I don't know if I should do something with this. Like that's kind of what
Mhm.
submission is like. Um, but I've just been trying to like, I will say the first couple months were very difficult. I don't think I did much writing at all. Um, because you're just so nervous all the time and you have no idea when you're going to get an email that's like the best news of your life or the worst news of your life. But eventually you just kind of like move on, you find a new idea to fixate on. And I think it's very, very healthy to, when you're on submission and when you're querying, to work on your next project and to believe that the book that you wrote is, that's not a fluke, that you can do it again and that you can find the passion for another project, because it can be very easy to get tunnel visioned, and to believe like this is the one book and I'm, if this doesn't sell then I'm not a writer, which is not true. You'll find another idea and you'll surprise yourself by um, the fact that you can find passion for another project.
Yeah, and I think even before getting to that stage, a lot of how motivated to start writing the next project you are does depend on how you feel about your previous writing.
Yeah, it's true. I know a lot of times querying writers and writers on sub are always like, I don't know how I can possibly focus on my next book, and I feel that. I think it's very easy to get caught in the slump, but I think it just takes time, to be honest. I think like distance makes you feel not as attached to the project, so that when you do start getting rejections, you don't start to see those rejections as a rejection of like your worthiness and your craft, and your value like as a person.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It is such a subjective field.
Uh-huh.
So it can be hard not to take it personally, but also you got to keep going because the more manuscripts you have under your belt, the more, well, I guess the probability stays the same that you'll actually end up there, but it still
Yeah.
feels like your probability is going up somehow.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's like it's good to have a backlist. Like even the books that don't get an agent or don't sell, that's just like in your back pocket, so that eventually when you do finally publish, you'll like, you can have those other manuscripts to be like, hey, I've already written this book. And there's like a likelihood that, you know, the journey with that book isn't over.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm curious what drew you to speculative fiction in particular, because that's like a lot of what I'm drawn to writing as well, like horror,
Yeah.
thrillers with speculative elements, fantasy. So, like, what is it that pulls you to this genre umbrella?
Yeah. It's funny because well, I've been writing since I was a kid. Not that I like count any of those stories as like real stories, but I think I've always been a very like, I think as a kid, I always wanted to believe in things that are beyond our world. I think that that's something that's very inherent to a lot of children. And
Hmm.
as I got older, I actually started writing a lot more literary contemporary fiction. So there was a period of time, I think, end of high school through my university years, where I really thought that I was going to be a literary fiction writer. Um, I think I had grown up a lot with like John Green's work as a teenager. And then as I got older, I really liked like David Mitchell, um, just very, very literary works. And I think that's like, I think part of it also had to do with the elitism a little bit that's in the book community, where a lot of people who read exclusively literary fiction are like, oh, genre fiction, like fantasy, sci-fi, like that's all fake stuff, like that's for kids and stuff like that, which is obviously not true. But I think I unconsciously had this feeling that like, oh, I want to be a serious writer. I want to write mature things. I don't want to just write about magic and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
I did workshop when I was in university, and when you're in a writing workshop, a lot of the times it is very focused on literary fiction, unless you're in a specific genre focused. workshop. So I think that also contributed to why I felt like literary fiction was the only thing that I could write. And then it wasn't until the pandemic hit and I started just like reading a lot again and just finding my interest in genre stories again that I was like, these are the ideas that I find most exciting. Is just like building new worlds and exploring the ways that, you know, magic or technology can be can be used to make commentary on some kind of societal issue that I'm interested in or that I feel very passionately about. So that's kind of where a lot of my stories start. Actually, is like theme, world, and theme. So yeah, I think it's just like for me, I feel like the most exciting stories are the ones that are like that ask questions of what if. I think I've always kind of just been drawn to those kind of stories.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how even though the world tries to push us in different directions, we all kind of end up where we're drawn to naturally. Because I
Yeah.
definitely relate to a
Yeah.
lot of what you said about like maybe more mystical elements and the what if and like just adding a little bit of magic to life. It
Yeah.
can be very attractive. And I don't know why we can't have both. Like why can't it be literary in the way it's written and also have
Yes. Very
those
true.
elements of genre? Like in some ways I feel like that's harder because then you're trying to do more things at once and they have to work well
Yeah.
together.
Yeah. 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 It's funny because, like, when I was writing my sci fi book, and I was like, it's like I would be rereading The Great Gatsby because I'm writing a retelling of it. And I'd just be like, the reason that The Great Gatsby is only 40,000 words is because like Fitzgerald doesn't have to do world building. He doesn't have to like stop and explain like this magical concept. And so sometimes I would get like jealous of like literary fiction writers, and I'm like, you just take place in the real world. Obviously, there's its own challenges, but yeah, I I think it's like interesting that I just kind of went back to, even as an adult, I just went back to what I was writing when I was a kid, kind of.
Mhm. Yeah, same. Is it really only 40,000 words? It's been a while since I read it.
I think it's definitely under 50,000, I believe. If not
Wow.
40,000, then like 45, 47. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's very short.
Yeah, I never realized.
It's
Yeah.
kind of a novella, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you are under 50K. It must be novella. So what would you say is like your I like to call it marination process, like when you're like
Oh,
starting to get those ideas and they're just
yeah.
simmering and kind of building until you have enough momentum to start writing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think every writer is different. I have a very long marination process, and I don't necessarily like to give this as advice. I guess I'd be very curious about your process too. But I think I spend when I get an idea, I don't write it right away. So I usually wait uh, like months, like weeks or months. And by wait, I mean like I'm typically writing something else. Like when I start getting ideas for a new book, so I don't really stop to write the idea when I get it. I would rather finish what I'm currently writing before I like switch gears because I'm very like one track minded.
Yeah.
So I think it's like I kind of typically get a bunch of ideas and then I just kind of drop them in like a Google Doc or my notes app. And then um, at some point, I'll feel like if I find like several ideas that are like working really well together, I think I might start to see a plot. Um, then I'll kind of like start to try to organize um, all of my sporadic ideas. And then um, if I come up with a premise and I really like it, that's when I'll start outlining. And I'll put it in like, I'll try to think of like an actual story arc and I'll start developing characters. Um, but I think the reason that I don't like to write an idea too quickly is because A, I'm an outliner. So I like to know what I'm writing before I write it. And also B, I think that like I want to be sure that I'm excited about it. And sometimes when you first get an idea, it's like the shiny, it just feels exciting because it's shiny, but you don't actually know if it's like interesting enough to write. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think I already know at least the next like two books that I will probably want to write, and I'm doing like
Wow.
research for them. I think my next book is going to be a contemporary fantasy, and it's going to be not just like speak too much about it because I don't even know yet, but it's going to be very focused on like law as a practice. So I I'm like consulting my lawyer friend very
Wow.
deeply about it, and I think it's going to be a long research process. So I don't anticipate I'm going to write that until next year, or even the year after that. So um, I think that's kind of what marination feels like to me, but uh, it depends on the book. Sometimes I can write a book a lot faster than other books, but I guess for you, like, do you feel like you spend a lot of time thinking and outlining an idea before you actually write it?
Not usually. Like, I really related to how you described almost like clustering your ideas to see if there's enough there to like make a narrative out of it. So I will
Hmm.
usually wait a bit for those clusters to come up and see like which things I can string together. But for
Hmm.
my last novel that I just finished like the first draft of, um, I started to get a lot of ideas really fast while I was writing the book before that, kind of like what you were saying.
Yeah.
And for that one, it was a lot of like needing to learn about neuroscience and like physics stuff that like I had to do research on.
Oh
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
did start to outline it pretty carefully because otherwise it would have been too overwhelming. I don't usually
Yeah.
outline too much.
Yeah.
Um and even when I do, it still like changes around. Like do you find that to be your experience as well that like once you
Oh,
get
for
to a
sure.
chapter, like you get more inspiration?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think like I used to be very like meticulous about my outline where if I deviated from it, I would have to like re-outline the whole, I would stop and re-outline the book and then went back to it. But I think now that I'm more comfortable with myself as a writer, I outline a lot less. So I don't with my current book, I'm not actually doing a chapter by chapter outline from from the start. Like I kind of would just like do high level plot points for each act. And then when I get to the end of
Mm-hmm.
one act, I'll do like a little bit of a deeper outline. But um, I kind of like have found that I can't really perfectly outline a book from start to finish anymore because, like you said, it's just like part of writing is like you also figuring out what the story is. So there's just like no
Mm-hmm.
way for me to perfectly outline. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel like some of the best ideas come just in the moment. I don't know, from the
Yes.
unconscious or wherever.
Yeah.
But that's interesting that, like, as you write more and more, you started off as a plotter and now you're plotting less. I started off like
Yeah.
really against outlining for myself, and I feel like
Hmm.
now I'm getting more into it because after trying it, it's like, well, like the pacing
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense when you do it that
Yes,
way.
yes. I think plotting definitely has its advantages in the sense that you can get a sense for like, do I have too many plot beats or do I have too little? I tend to be an overwriter, so if I don't plot enough, I'll just end up like having 10,000 side plots that are just hanging at the end because I'm like, oh no, and then I have to like go back and cut so many things out. So yeah, but I also know that too much outlining can definitely stifle a writer. I know a lot of writers are like that.
Mhm. What is your writing routine? Like when you sit down and you're like
Ooh,
about to write for the day?
yeah, I don't think that I have a routine, and I think like it's it's very dependent on the day, especially if you I write, but I also have a full-time job. So, I think one thing that I am very uh, loud about advocating against is like the whole write every day mentality. Because I think that that leads to burnout so quickly when you put that expectation on
Mhm.
newer writers to be like, oh, I just can't seem to finish my book. And then they hear the advice, oh, just write every day and you'll get there. And it's like, that's actually not great advice because you're just going to get very tired. So I think my typical writing routine is on a weekday, I will wake up, and if it's not a busy work day, I will actually first thing in the morning when I'm most productive, I will read over what I wrote on my last writing session. I'll do a little bit of editing, and then when I'm writing a fresh scene, I will pick up a book that I feel like is similar to the voice or the genre that I want to write in, and I'll like kind of just like get inspired. Like I like to start my writing sessions by reading. And then I
Mhm.
will write a little bit and then I'll work the whole day. I'll take a break for like dinner and then to unwind. And then I have like an evening writing session and I usually write all the way to bedtime and I sleep very, very late. I work from home, so I can wake up late as well. And I usually will stop writing around midnight to 1, and if I'm still very awake, I'll like read or play video games until I get tired. So that's anywhere from like 1 to 2. And I will typically sleep around like 1:30 to 2. So yeah, that's like me on a weekday. On weekends, if my weekends are free, I write like the entire day if I can.
Wow.
I try to take advantage
Yeah,
of
that just
my
shows,
weekends.
yeah, just shows your passion for it.
Yeah.
I agree with the not writing every day. I feel like when people force themselves to write, it almost like first of all the writing's worse and then you feel worse about it, so then you don't feel as
Yeah.
confident the next time and it just
That's
you're
so
just digging
true.
yourself into a trench.
Yeah. That's one thing about me too is like if I don't like what I wrote the previous writing session, I can't go on. Like I have to edit it. Sometimes I'll feel really bad about it and I won't want to write. Yeah.
Do you ever find that when you look back at it, you're like, oh, it's actually not so bad?
Sometimes, but I always find that the morning right after is like always the worst. It's
Mm.
like always the moment where I'm like, yikes. But what's funny is that I took like last week I took a week break from writing, or maybe it was the week before that. But there was like 5 days where I just didn't write. And I was so scared to check my draft again because I'm like, I know the draft is in a bad place. It's going to be horrible. But then I just read it top down, like it was something like 30,000 words. I read it in one sitting and I was like, you know what? It's not even bad. So sometimes you just like get in your head and it really depends on your mood and how you're feeling. Um, it's never as bad as you think it is.
Yeah, and sometimes I think we also idealize it in our heads, like, oh, this is going to be the most immaculate piece of writing that I've ever made. And then when you actually get into it, it's like, no, it's
Yeah.
much more sticky than that. And then
Yeah.
afterwards, it's like, well, okay, it's not perfect, but like, it's not as bad as I was picturing in my head.
Yeah, for sure.
And I also really like what you said about starting with reading. I've never done that, but it makes sense because I have noticed like the tone of what I read usually impacts the tone of how I write. So
Yeah.
I prefer more like purple prose. I know not everyone does. I don't mean like
Oh, it's
poetic
okay.
and
I do too.
pompous, but like, yeah, I good. We're on the same page. And so I find that like when I read something that's very just threadbare, just like Molly looked at the fireworks. The fireworks were red. You know, like I really
Yeah.
find that it
Yeah.
negatively affects my writing.
Me too.
Versus when I
Yeah.
read something that's more like floral, then somehow like how poetic and lyrical it is. Like I feel like
Yeah.
it infuses into me somehow.
Yeah. I find that too. Like, I think I I will often like I have like a rotation of writers where it's just like it doesn't matter what I'm writing. I know that like if I just like read any of their books, I'll be inspired to write.
Hmm. Who are your favorites?
A lot of Fitzgerald's, naturally. I think like last year and the year before that, I was like basically only reading Fitzgerald, which is like it's nice to have a break from him. But I think David Mitchell is also on that list. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Um, there's more, but I'm blanking. But like those are like definitely my safe ones, I would say.
Hmm. Nice. You mentioned sort of juggling work and writing, and I'm sure also self care. How is that for you? Like, what are the challenges? How do you balance it all?
Yeah, I think balance is something that I struggle with constantly. And I think I have had some pretty difficult experiences with my mental health this year specifically, um, which I think can be very difficult to accept when you like, because it's gotten to a point where it's just like I had to go see a doctor for it, which is like very, um, I think, scary when it happens to you for the first time, where you're like, wow, I actually really do need to get some help. Um, I'm like fine, but it was a lot of like having trouble sleeping and a lot of anxiety, and a lot of it is connected to my writing, which is like it's a very tough thing, because writing starts out being this thing that you do as an escape and for fun and to help you mentally. But then when you step your foot into publishing and you let the kind of external forces into your writing journey, it can become a very stressful thing. So I think in terms of balance, the main thing that I've had to find is that I can't force myself to write some days. Like if I feel like if I can't get myself writing within 10 minutes, then I allow myself to not write that day, because I think I start to feel very resentful. And then the other thing is, like, I use social media less. Um, and I think that that actually really does help, because you start to compare yourself a lot on social media to like other people's writing journeys. And I think taking a step back is very, very important. And then I also try to just like surround myself more with like leaving the house and seeing my friends more, and just allowing myself to not talk about writing or to think about writing, and to remind myself that like I'm a human being outside of writing. Because I have always, since I was a kid, very much like attached my identity to writing, which can be great because it's like, my dream and I'm happy to do it. But it can also lead to things like feeling very, like having your whole day, your whole week derailed when you get a rejection, which is obviously just
Mm-hmm.
like not sustainable. Um, and I think I always try to remind myself that like I'm not on any schedule to publish by a certain time. Like I think the when I publish, it will be whether it's next year or like 5 years from now. I just want to make sure that I still love writing, and I care a lot more about maintaining my relationship with my craft more than I care about a publishing deadline. Because if I only focus on publishing, it makes me very unhappy as a writer. So part of maintaining my love for my craft is not, seeing it as a punishment and not forcing myself to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like you've really figured out how to work around writing negatively impacting you emotionally. And I'm sorry that it was such a hard year. I know it can definitely be hard to
Yeah.
be in this industry.
Yeah, yeah, I'm working through it. I think I've been a lot better, and I have like a support circle, so it's all good.
It's like what can bring you up so high can also bring you down so low. It's hard to
Yeah,
not have both at the same time.
yeah. And I'm sure like you're experiencing a lot of like the same feelings with querying, because I was also this time last year I was querying, and I was also like terrible. Like my emotional state was also in the gutter.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be hard to not place your self-esteem on it. And I know we've been talking about how like it's so subjective, but like I feel like
Hmm.
anyone who wants to improve would wonder in the back of their head, like maybe I'm doing something, maybe there's something I need to improve. Like in some sense, I feel
Yeah,
like that's healthy to do.
yeah.
So how long was the querying process for you?
For me, it was technically, I want to say 6 weeks, maybe
Oh
eight
wow.
weeks, including, yeah. So what I always say is that like there's no normal publishing schedule. Um, I know people who've gotten an agent within a week, and other people who wrote multiple books, multiple years. And I don't think either is any indication of how good your book is. I think it is more an indication of what you wrote and how it is timed with the current market. So
Hmm.
you know, last year, I think if you were writing a romantasy, and maybe even this year, and your prose was not half bad, you would probably get an agent very quickly. Um, so it just really depends on the trends, on the market, which agents are open when you're querying, stuff like that. But yeah, for me, it was like 6 weeks and to get my first offer. And it felt like the longest 6 weeks of my life. I know in hindsight, it's just like I was very lucky to sign with an agent that I like sincerely wanted to work with so quickly. But yeah, it was like I just kind of wrote the book. I revised it for 2 weeks, and then I was like, should I query it? Like I didn't really know if I wanted to because everyone told me that science fiction is very bleak and science fiction doesn't sell and all this kind of stuff. But I was like, you know what? I'm writing a retelling. I think the only reason I queried it is because I was writing a retelling, and I was like, retellings are typically high concept, like easy to pitch. So I was like, I'll just do it. And I lucked out. I signed with like an agent that I really admire and I really, really love her list. And she's incredibly experienced and very supportive and very editorial. And she kind of helped me sort of level my expectations and be like, this is how editors think, and this is how we should, edit your manuscript to give it the best chance. So yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, sounds like the stars aligned for you. I'm really glad that you got what you wanted in such a short period of time. For those watching that don't know, 6 weeks is very short.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely lucked out. I think, sometimes you just find an agent who what they're looking for is what you like writing. But I also know a lot of people who've had very, very long querying journeys and then sold very fast. So um, it all works out in the end.
Yeah, and fingers crossed that the publishing will also be fast for you because I'm excited to read this.
I hope we'll have to see.
Do you have any last words of advice for anyone watching who's querying, maybe?
Um, I think when it comes to querying, the first thing is definitely don't compare your timeline to other writers' timelines because, yeah, it sucks if you're like querying for a year and you're just watching all these people get their offers so quickly. But just because you have a long querying period does not mean that your book is bad, and it does not mean that um, your book won't sell. So the actual time it takes is not an indication of the quality of your manuscript. The other thing I would say is like don't be so quick to implement any kind of feedback that you get in a rejection, unless you start to see multiple agents give you the same feedback. And even then, I would say um, consult a critique partner, beta readers, before you like completely tear your book open. And then the third thing is like just don't query alone. If you can, like even if you just like lurk around writing Twitter or whatever social platform is most comfortable to you. Because for the first like 2 weeks that I was querying, I didn't tell anyone because I was like, whatever. It's just like I'm not serious about it. But then the rejections were very tough because you have nowhere to put those emotions. And I think it's very even if it's like someone just in your life where you can be like, every time I got a rejection, I can just talk about it with someone. One thing that I did with queer rejections and also with editor rejections now is every time I get a rejection, I like treat myself. And I just go out with like a friend or my brother or something, and I just like go get a coffee or like I get a little treat, like just so that it's like the world doesn't end because of that one rejection or 10 rejections or 20. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's a
Yeah, I
numbers
like that.
game and it's luck. It's really luck.
Mm. Well, and skill too, I'm sure. I'm sure your
Yes.
manuscript
Yeah.
is very good.
Hopefully.
But yeah, I will definitely be trying that with the rejection so that hopefully I get excited every time a rejection comes in.
Yeah, it's good to know that you're not being ghosted. I think the worst thing is to not hear back at all. So
Yeah, yeah, it's tough. Well, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about your
Yeah, of course.
journey and for the advice. I will put Chris's socials in a pinned comment for anyone that wants to check out her channel, and definitely stay tuned for when her books come out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was such a fun chat.